Welcome back, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the intersection between theories and actual hands-on research. So in order to do that, what we're going to start off with is a brief discussion of what theories are and the components that are involved in theories. Then we're going to take a look at how we bridge theories into actual research. And that's with this process called operationalization. Operationalization is where we go and take the abstract concepts from theories and then figure out how to measure those concepts in a concrete fashion for the purposes of data collection. Finally, we're going to talk about various research design types that we'll be covering throughout this course and get an idea of what kind of information they can provide to us. The readings that correspond to this particular lecture are chapters 1 and 2 from your course textbook, but also I would like you to take a look at two things that I posted in the content handout section of Beachboard. And specifically, I don't care if you read the whole articles, but I would like you to take a look at the methods sections of these two articles. One about self-control, one about video games and their influence on individuals. In both of these, the research designs that they've chosen are survey-based research, which is a huge component of criminological, psychological, and sociological research focusing on humans. So you can get an idea of what goes into describing your study and what you would put into the methods section of a particular research study. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, we have to figure out what is a theory. In its simplest sense, a theory is a tentative or preliminary explanation of causal relationships. Now, a theory can be very simple. It can be something as simple as, I theorize that if you smoke too many cigarettes over the course of several years, you will develop lung cancer. So it's pretty much an A and a B. Or a theory can be much more complex. If I'm trying to predict or theorize about why some people engage in crime and some people don't as an outcome, I might say that, well, it depends on your level of intelligence, certain social factors about the type of neighborhood that you grew up in. Maybe there are some psychological or biological factors that play into it. Maybe it's pure opportunity factors. Maybe there are other sort of social factors that play into it as far as what are the opportunities for jobs in your area? Is there racial inequality in the area that you live? So in that sense, a theory can become much more vast. But remember, a theory, they're not facts. They are always sort of a combination of predictions and hypotheses. And the idea of a theory is that in order for a theory to be respected, it needs to be tested in order to be supported or refuted. We spoke in the previous lecture about the importance of replication with research. And that's how a good theory that stays around and is respected is one that is tested and supported over and over again. And that's one of the things we want to make sure we keep in mind. Within each theory, we have hypotheses. You may have one hypothesis or you may have multiple hypotheses for all the links within the theory. But we want to make sure that one of the most important things to remember about a good hypothesis is what we see down here at the bottom of this slide. It is a prediction of causal association between two or more constructs, including the direction of causation. So if I predict that using drugs influences academic performance for high school students, a good hypothesis doesn't just ask a question and say, I wonder if drugs influence academic performance, or even a statement, I think drugs have an influence on your academic performance. A good hypothesis should include those two constructs, but also is a prediction with direction. So what I mean by that is a good hypothesis might be, I believe that the more somebody uses illicit drugs during high school, the worse they will perform in their courses. So you see that prediction and direction. So let's take a little closer look at that. So here are two examples of research questions at the top of this slide. Our first research question says, does the use, this is the same one I just did, does the use of illicit drugs influence academic performance? And the second one says, does the rising use of portable electronic devices have an impact on police-community relations? So, how do I translate a research question that I might be interested in into a testable hypothesis? So let's look at research question 1. Does the use of illicit drugs influence academic performance? I translate that into a testable hypothesis by making it directional and with a prediction. So you'll see under hypotheses number 1, individuals who use illicit drugs at a higher frequency will perform poorer in school. You see that prediction and the direction of movement between those two variables. Same idea with research question number 2 about the use of portable electronic devices having an impact on police-community relations. And I think this was sort of came up with that idea of like the rising use of body cameras, which obviously, and other video and audio devices that many of us are carrying every day. So with that one, if I want to translate that into a testable hypothesis, it may look something like what we see as number 2. In areas where more police community interactions are caught on video, the public perception of police officers will be negative. Now, you may go, oh, wait, I don't like that. I think that if there's more police community interactions are caught on video, the public perception will be positive. That's fine. The key thing as a researcher is when you make that hypothesis, you have to pick a side. Which way am I going with this? And when writing this one up, I just chose to go with that particular direction. And the bottom line, whenever you think about research questions and hypotheses, never forget the so what question. What do I mean by the so what question? Don't waste our time, is what I'm getting at. The public, the people who are funding research, students, teachers, everyone, we don't need to hear a study that we go, okay, yeah, that was pretty common sense. That didn't really tell me much. One of the things that we always want to think about is the research I'm doing, is it actually contributing to the betterment of society? Am I filling a gap that wasn't there before? Am I looking into something from a new angle or a new lens? Or am I focusing on applying a theory or testing a theory with a new population? And so you're going to hear me say that throughout this course quite a bit. Never forget the so what. Why are you doing this? And why, if I'm the person who's going to read your research, why should I care? So always kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So also with theory, we want to think about, well, what are the guidelines for what we would call a quote unquote good theory? And you'll notice here I have several things listed. The two that I have in capitals I think are kind of a good starting point for us. This isn't a theory class, this is a research methods class, but we want to see the connection between theory and methods. So one of the key things for a good theory is the whole idea of keep it simple. The keep it simple is known as parsimony in the realm of research methods. Efficiency, the fewest number of moving things. And what I mean by that are constructs and causal linkages. And you'll see that in a couple slides when we start breaking down theory formation. The easier it is to explain some sort of event, the more parsimonious it is. If you look at Gottfredson and Hershey's The General Theory of Crime, at least in an overview of it, they basically say people engage in criminal behavior because of lack of self-control, period. That is very parsimonious. If you contrast that with Sutherland's differential association theory, you'll notice he has quite a few concepts about people learn crime through close interaction with others. They learn motivations for crime. That once they learn the motivations, they learn sort of a balance of the why and why I should not do certain things. And he goes on, and there's quite a few components, and it's still a good theory, but it's not nearly as simple as that initial one that I talked about, where low self-control, you're going to engage in crime. Another thing for a good theory is what is known as generality. Generality is the ability to explain more events in multiple settings, multiple populations, and across multiple time periods. So for any theory, especially when we're trying to do a theory of deviant behavior or a theory of criminal behavior, it's hard to have that one single theory apply to multiple settings, populations, and times. So I may have a theory that can explain why certain juvenile delinquents engage in one particular type of crime, or why women engage in shoplifting, right? Which is kind of focused. So a better theory is if you can explain why men and women engage in multiple types of crimes. And if it actually, once it's being tested, if you find that it works with different populations, people in different states, different cities, different countries, and it holds true over the course of time, you've got a pretty darn good theory on your hand. Then at the bottom of this slide, we see three other sort of, wrap up things for a good theory. One is internal logic. It should make sense. Two, as I've already stressed a little bit, it needs to be able to be replicated when we actually test the theory. So what I mean by agreement with the data is a theory is only as good as research studies that support it. So that's agreement with data. And going hand in hand with that, it's got to be able to be tested given our current scientific principles that we have, given the current technology that we have, and that will make a good theory. Let's go ahead and move forward. Okay, so on this slide, you're seeing what looks like a blank sort of, you see one oval, and you see a bunch of arrows, one with two heads to it, the other one's all over the place. What is this? This is, imagine I just decided to brainstorm about a theory. Let's say that I've been interested in the idea of why do kids commit crime, right? Obviously, if you're a parent, you don't want your kids getting locked up or thrown in jail. And if you're a citizen, you don't want to be robbed by some person. And if you're a kid, you also want to figure out, how do I stay out of trouble, right? So I might be interested in this idea of why do adolescents commit crime? Well, what we're showing here on this slide is sort of the brainstorming idea of how a theory can start off simple and all of a sudden you start considering other things. So my outcome that I just popped up is, that is my end game. That's my effect, committing crime. I'm trying to explain that within my theory. I might say, well, one of the things that leads people to commit crime is the peer group, who they hang out with. Right? If you hang out with bad kids, you learn bad things and you become a criminal. Another thing is, in order to commit crime, I need to know how to commit crime, right? I'm not going to go in and do some sort of like Ocean's 11 movie of like robbing a bank or taking over a casino unless I know how to do all those intricate things that are needed for that criminal enterprise. Even selling drugs, I need to know where to get them, how to weigh them, how to find customers, etc. So I might add that in. Also, I might think about, well, certain people may go, I don't know if committing crime is a good thing for me because it may have an influence on my opportunities in life. Do I need to commit crime in order to get through? Maybe my level of economic opportunity in my life, it has an influence on that, right? And then also maybe it's just certain people are predisposed. Maybe they're thrill seekers or looking to get that rush. So what you see here is, and I've pretty much taken a bits and pieces from a variety of different criminological theories and thrown them together. For those of you who are familiar with various criminological theories, you see a little bit of biological positivism, you see a little bit of strain theory, you see a little bit of a differential association. But what happens here is you can see it gets pretty complex pretty quick. And so what I have, by looking at this, you'll notice very few things point directly to committing crime. Oftentimes there's something, a mediating factor that they have to go through. So like the peer group, just because I hang out with bad people doesn't mean I'm going to commit crime. Maybe my peer group, and look at the arrows leading away from peer group. Maybe the people I hang out with teach me some of the knowledge of criminal techniques. And once I have the knowledge, I'm able to commit crime. And then you'll notice, looking at committing crime, there's an arrow that goes back to knowledge of criminal techniques, right? The more you commit crime, the better you're going to get at it because you learn what to do and what not to do. Also looking at the peer group, that may have an influence on how much I perceive formal education to be important to me. And if I think formal education is important, maybe I will avoid crime. Or if I think it's not important and I just want to make a quick buck, selling stolen goods or robbing people or selling drugs, that might lead me to commit crime. So what we see here is, as these arrows are included throughout this theory, whichever way the arrow is pointing is saying, I think that this thing influences that. So peer group influences knowledge of criminal techniques. Peer group influences the perception of formal education. Level of economic opportunity influences perception of formal education. Biological distribution or predisposition leads to whether or not I'm likely to commit crime. So when we start to model a theory, this is, even though it looks like sort of child's play, it's not uncommon for researchers to sit down when they're thinking about studying a particular concept and sort of just brainstorm it in a similar fashion like this. So let's take a little closer look to what are these arrows mean and what are these things that we see in these ovals. So what we see here is when you're modeling a theory or even a simple one like this, that level of economic opportunity may have an influence on committing crime. When you write things out in sort of circles or ovals, they're known as constructs. And constructs are much more of an abstract thing. So, abstract mental ideas. What do I mean by that? Well, in the realm of research, they're not concrete, they're unmeasurable. We need to define them. So, for example, look at level of economic opportunity there on the left. How do I measure that? Right? I mean, if I say, oh, this person has a low level of economic opportunity, and maybe somebody else has a higher level of economic opportunity, you can kind of get that, but how exactly do we operationalize that? How do I measure that? Same thing with committing crime. I say, oh, this person commits crime. Well, I didn't say what type of crime. I didn't say how frequently they commit crime. It's still very abstract. And from a researcher, if I'm going to go conduct a study and write up my results and present them to the world, I need to make these abstract things into concrete, clear-cut, very understandable things for my audience to understand. So let's take a look at how we're going to go into there. One last thing before we move on to the next slide, though, is you'll notice I don't just call them constructs. The one on the left, the level of economic opportunity, you'll notice I say exogenous construct. Exogenous is just a fancy word for a causal construct. Exo simply means that the reason for it existing is outside of the theory. So exogenous means we're not trying to explain why you happen to live in an area with a certain amount of economic opportunity or not. We're just using that as a starting point. We're just taking that as some people have it, some people don't. We're not trying to explain that in this particular theory. On the other hand, or the other side, on the right side, we have committing crime. And you'll notice it's a simple way about this one is end. It's the end of your arrow, right? So it's endogenous construct, or the more technical way to interpret that is that the reason for its existence is explained within the theory, right? It's at the end of an arrow. So we're saying we think that economic opportunity explains why some people commit more crime, some people commit less crime. And so that's sort of the idea of endogenous and exogenous constructs. So quick review, we'll see it on another slide. Exogenous construct is our causal constructs. Endogenous constructs are our effects or our outcomes. Let's go ahead and move forward. All right, so one more quick review of how we conceptualize exogenous and endogenous constructs. think about whether or not there is an arrow pointing to that construct. So if we start at the left, level of economic opportunity, that is an exogenous construct. Why? Because there's no arrow pointing to it. We're just taking that as our starting point. It's a given, and we're not trying to explain it within the theory. We move a little bit to the center of the slide and we see perception of value of formal education. That is called an endogenous construct. Why? Because it has an arrow pointing to it. Our theory is proclaiming or theorizing that your level of economic opportunity has an influence or influences your perception of formal education. And finally, at the very far end, committing crime is also an endogenous construct because it has an arrow pointing to it. This theory is saying that, well, it actually has two things kind of influencing it, right? It has economic opportunity is influencing perception of formal education, which then in turn it influences whether or not you start committing crime. Okay. Now, number two for this PowerPoint or for this lecture is how do we go from the theoretical, from the theories and constructs and the abstract, how do we now translate this into much more measurable, concrete things? So this is what is known as the process of operationalization. This is a word that if you're not familiar with it, you're going to be sick and tired of it by the end of this class, and I apologize in advance, but it is one of the most important concepts of research. How do I operationalize my constructs? How do I go from these abstract ideas and get them into something that is measurable, that I can actually collect data about, and then also explain to my audience how I measured a particular construct, right? I can't look at somebody necessarily and go, oh, yeah, they have this level of economic opportunity, or this person has higher or lower. I need a way to measure that. So what we see on the top here, still in those ovals, are the constructs. Level of economic opportunity, and we theorize that it influences whether or not you will commit crime. Below those, you'll notice now we've become much more concrete, like bricks, and that's why they're in rectangles. Now, in the process of operationalization, we move from constructs down to variables. And variables, as you can see on the slide, are concrete, measurable indicators of underlying constructs. So this is so important. Every time you do a research study, you need to tell people how you are operationalizing your theoretical constructs. So let's take a look at level of economic opportunity. Well, how do I measure that? Well, one way that a researcher might get an idea of what is the level of economic opportunity in a certain neighborhood or city is to go out and get information, collect data about the number of available jobs in a certain radius, right? If there are a lot of available job hirings in your area, you may have a decent amount of economic opportunity. If there are very few jobs available for anyone, you have a low level of economic opportunity. So hopefully you get an idea of how that variable number of available jobs becomes a much more concrete indicator of that underlying construct. Now, does that mean that everyone's going to agree that that variable number of available jobs is a perfect way to measure the construct? No. And in the lectures to come, we'll talk about things like reliability and validity of our variables. So keep those terms, reliability and validity, at least in the back of your mind for now. Not every study measures a construct in a perfect way. That's one of the ways that we have to sort of scrutinize research and understand research. That's the beauty of it, but it's also the challenge as a researcher to do it well. And you have to sometimes go back and forth, thinking like, what's the best way to measure economic opportunity in a certain neighborhood, right? So you can imagine, just as one example, we might do something like this. Now, once that construct has been translated into a variable, it is either known as an independent variable or a dependent variable. The independent variable, number of available jobs, is our causal variable. So it kind of goes hand in hand with that exogenous construct, is operationalized into an independent variable. When we look at the outcome or the effect, the committing crime, If you look at the dots going below that one, we see that we operationalize committing crime by measuring the number of self-reported burglaries, right? So in this case, you may imagine surveying individuals and say, how many burglaries have you committed in the last year, right? And that's, once again, just one narrow view of committing crime. We could also ask about whether or not they assaulted somebody, whether or not they shot somebody, whether or not they were using drugs. I mean, we could go on for days, but it gives you an example of how this abstract idea of measuring whether or not somebody is committing crime by asking a question on a survey that says, how many burglaries have you engaged in the last year? We get a way to have a concrete indicator of that concept. And same thing that we saw with the other one, with the number of available jobs. Now, for our outcome or our effect, that is the endogenous construct is operationalized into a dependent variable. So independent variable is cause, dependent variable is outcome. Let's move on. All right. So to wrap up this lecture, one of the things I want to at least briefly introduce you to is some of the ideas of the various research design types we're going to be seeing throughout this course, and just give you a glimpse of how the types of things that they can answer for us. So far, we've talked about the logic of criminal justice research. We've seen theories, we've seen operationalization. We also talked about the ability to explain causal associations, and the type of research methods that you use will have an impact on the types of information you can provide. So we often talk about qualitative methods as being a good starting point. You'll notice here some examples of qualitative research are things like field observation, case studies, ethnographies. If you've ever taken an anthropology course, you probably are somewhat familiar with ethnographical research, case studies. I know if you've taken a course with Dr. Perrone, when we're looking at small samples of, say, drug users or a specific type of offender, Dr. Shug looks at individuals who, serial killers and things of that nature. Case studies are where we go in depth into hand examining one situation or one individual. Now, we don't necessarily have a large sample size, but you can get a lot of really good phenomenological information. And remember, that phenomenological focus is where we sort of look at the world through the eyes of the beholder. Truth and reality are determined from a particular person's point of view. So qualitative methods are really good for getting us our feet wet with trying to understand a certain topic, or when we're trying to study things that aren't happening on a large scale, right? So as fascinating as people may be with, say, serial killers, there's really not that many of them out there, right? I mean, there's a lot more shoplifters running around the world, thank goodness, than there are serial killers. So sometimes, depending upon what you're studying, that will dictate the appropriate method. So what are qualitative methods good for? They're definitely good at describing, definitely good at telling the larger story from the point of view of the subject, right? They're very personal. And so in many ways, they add a lot of that richness. But as far as the ability for the findings from qualitative research to be very generalizable to a larger population, sometimes they're limited in that. On the other side of it, we have what most of our research in criminology are based upon, which are known as quantitative methods. So we will be spending quite a bit of time focusing on quantitative methods throughout this course. Sort of the correlational research, the first one that we see right under the term quantitative methods there, are examples like surveys and questionnaires. And I've designed this course where even the research and the papers that you're going to be writing are going to look heavily at surveys and questionnaires. Why? Because you can collect a lot of data with a bunch of questions from a lot of people really cheap, really efficiently. You can imagine if I want to go interview a bunch of people in prison and interview them one at a time with me taking notes, that takes a long time. But if I want to distribute 100, 1,000 surveys to inmates or the general population and have them fill out 25, 30, 40, 50 questions and get them back to me really quick, boom, I can collect data really quickly. But we'll notice that there are a lot of limitations to that, and we'll go deeper into that as we progress through the course. But what kind of focus do these surveys and questionnaires have? Well, they fall under that idea of the positivist focus. So they're seeking out sort of those universal truths. They're not coming from a phenomenological point of view. They're looking much more at that positivist, trying to explain connections that seem to show up across a larger population or group of individuals. So when we think about what are they good for, they're good for getting that association component of causality, that first step of causality. And we can use statistics to say, yes, there's a strong association between this thing and that thing, and things of that nature. Now, when we really want to try to establish causation, and you may recall from our last lecture, the three things we needed to establish causation were: one, establish covariation or association; two, establish temporal precedence, that the cause comes before the effect; and three, rule out rival hypotheses. How do we get to that? That's where experimental methods come into play. So we'll talk about various types of experiments, from quasi-experiments to randomized true experiments. And not only are these good at explaining associations, but they're often the closest that we have to establish causation. But there's limitations for them too, because oftentimes it's unethical to do experiments about certain phenomenon. So we've got to think about every type of topic or concept you're choosing to study. You've got to pick the method that fits it best. So we'll leave it at that for today, and then see you in the next one.